In the summer of 1774, a 19-year-old prince ascended the throne of France at a moment when few could have imagined how dramatically his reign would end. His name was Louis XVI, and he inherited one of the most powerful and prestigious monarchies in Europe. He also inherited something far less visible, a kingdom burdened by debt, divided by privilege, and increasingly frustrated with the institutions that governed it. During the years that followed, Louis would attempt to reform France, struggle against powerful opposition, support the American Revolution, lose control of his government, and ultimately become the last king of France before the fall of the monarchy. Louis Auguste was born on August 23, 1754, at the Palace of Versailles, the grandson of King Louis XV. He was not originally expected to become king. Several members of the royal family stood ahead of him in the line of succession, but illness and death gradually changed his position. By the time his father died in 1765, Louis had become heir to the French throne. His education prepared him for kingship, but it did not prepare him for the extraordinary crisis that awaited him. In 1770, at the age of 15, Louis married Marie Antoinette, the 14-year-old daughter of the Austrian Empress Maria Theresa. The marriage was politically significant. France and Austria had once been bitter rivals, and the union was intended to strengthen their new alliance. Louis and Marie Antoinette would eventually become two of the most recognizable figures of the French Revolution, but their early years together were marked by youth, political expectations, and intense public scrutiny. When Louis became king in 1774, he inherited a monarchy whose grandeur concealed serious problems. France possessed enormous territory, a large population, and considerable military strength, but the government was struggling financially. The crown had accumulated substantial debts through decades of warfare and expensive administration. The French tax system was also deeply unequal. Different social groups possessed different privileges, and many of the wealthiest members of society were protected from some forms of taxation. Louis understood that reform was necessary. Unlike the image of an entirely indifferent monarch, sometimes presented in popular culture, he appointed ministers who attempted to address the kingdom's financial problems. One of the most important was Anne Robert Jacques Turgot, an economist and administrator who believed that France needed significant economic reforms. Turgot attempted to reduce government spending, encourage freer trade, and reform taxation. His proposals, however, threatened established interests and faced powerful opposition. Louis eventually dismissed Turgot, and other reform attempts followed with similarly limited success. The problem was not simply the king himself. France's political system made major reform extraordinarily difficult. The monarchy depended upon cooperation from institutions, nobles, courts, and privileged groups that could resist measures threatening their traditional positions. Louis found himself caught between the need for change and the political forces determined to prevent it. One of the most consequential decisions of his reign came when France entered the American Revolutionary War against Britain. Louis supported the American colonists partly because weakening Britain served French strategic interests. French military and financial assistance played an important role in the American victory, particularly during the final campaign at Yorktown in 1781. The victory was a triumph for France's international position, but it came at an enormous financial cost. The war added substantially to an already serious debt problem. France had helped defeat its greatest rival, but in doing so had pushed its own finances closer to collapse. The contradiction would become one of the defining tragedies of Louis's reign. By the late 1780s, the financial crisis had become impossible to ignore. Ministers attempted to introduce new taxes and reforms, but opposition prevented meaningful solutions. The government struggled to borrow money, and confidence in the monarchy weakened. Eventually, Louis was forced to summon the Estates General, a representative body divided into three orders: the clergy, the nobility, and the Third Estate, which represented the overwhelming majority of the population. The Estates General met at Versailles in May 1789. What began as an attempt to solve a financial crisis quickly became something much larger. Representatives of the Third Estate demanded a greater role in government and eventually declared themselves the National Assembly. The political authority of the monarchy was being challenged in a way that France had not experienced for generations. Then, in July, Paris erupted. On July 14, 1789, a crowd stormed the Bastille, a fortress and prison that had become a symbol of royal authority. The event was militarily limited in comparison with the conflicts that would follow, but its symbolic importance was enormous. Across France, people increasingly questioned the traditional structure of political power. Louis was faced with an impossible choice. He could attempt to suppress the revolutionary movement through force, or he could accept reforms and attempt to preserve the monarchy within a changing political system. For a time, he appeared willing to accept constitutional reform. But trust between the king and the revolutionary movement deteriorated rapidly. In October 1789, crowds from Paris marched to Versailles and demanded that the royal family move to Paris. Louis, Marie Antoinette, and their children were eventually transferred to the Tuileries Palace, where they lived under increasingly restrictive conditions. The king was still formally monarch, but his independence had been dramatically reduced. The relationship between Louis and the revolutionaries became even more complicated after the royal family's attempted escape from Paris in June 1791. The family was captured at Varennes and returned to the capital. The attempted flight convinced many revolutionaries that the king could no longer be trusted to support the new constitutional order. Louis's opponents increasingly regarded him not as a constitutional monarch, but as a potential enemy of the revolution. In 1792, France entered war with Austria and Prussia. The conflict intensified political tensions inside the country. Revolutionary leaders feared that foreign armies might restore the monarchy, while the royal family became increasingly associated with the possibility of counter-revolution. On August 10, 1792, revolutionaries attacked the Tuileries Palace. The monarchy was effectively overthrown, and Louis was imprisoned with his family. A few weeks later, the newly established National Convention formally abolished the monarchy and declared France a republic. Louis was no longer king. He was now referred to as Citizen Louis Capet, a name intended to strip away the symbolic authority of the crown. Yet his greatest trial was still to come. The revolutionary government accused him of conspiring against the nation and communicating with foreign powers. His trial became one of the most consequential political events of the revolution. Supporters argued that the former king should be spared, while revolutionaries insisted that allowing him to live would leave a potential rallying point for counter-revolution. In January 1793, the convention voted to execute him. On January 21st, Louis was taken to the Place de la Révolution in Paris, where he was executed by guillotine. He was 38 years old. His death represented far more than the end of one man's life. For centuries, French kings had been presented as the center of the political order. Louis XVI's execution demonstrated that the monarchy itself could be challenged, judged, and destroyed by the nation it had claimed to rule. Marie Antoinette was executed several months later, and the revolution entered an increasingly violent period. The reign of terror would follow, claiming thousands of lives as revolutionary factions turned against perceived enemies of the Republic. France would eventually pass through further political transformations, culminating in the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. The memory of Louis XVI remained deeply contested. To royalists, he became a tragic figure whose personal weaknesses were overshadowed by circumstances beyond his control. To revolutionaries, his execution represented the necessary destruction of an obsolete political system. Modern historians have generally viewed his reign with greater complexity. Louis was neither simply a tyrant nor an innocent victim. He was a monarch attempting to govern an increasingly unstable kingdom while struggling with political institutions that made reform extraordinarily difficult. His greatest weakness may have been his inability to make decisive choices at the moments when decisiveness mattered most. He recognized that France needed reform, but repeatedly hesitated when confronted with opposition. He accepted some revolutionary changes, resisted others, and ultimately lost the confidence of both the monarchy's traditional supporters and its reformist opponents. The tragedy of Louis XVI lies partly in the fact that the crisis of his reign was larger than the man himself. France's financial problems had been developing for decades. Social inequalities had deep roots. Enlightenment ideas had challenged traditional concepts of authority, while a growing public sphere allowed criticism of the monarchy to spread more widely than ever before. Louis inherited the consequences of these problems, but he was unable to solve them. His reign therefore stands at the boundary between two worlds. On one side was the old European order, built upon hereditary monarchy, social privilege, and centuries of tradition. On the other was a new political age in which citizens, constitutions, national sovereignty, and republican government would become increasingly powerful ideas. Louis XVI entered history as the King of France. He left it as the last French monarch to live in Versailles and the first French king in centuries to be executed by his own country. His story is ultimately not only the story of a king who lost his throne, it is the story of a society undergoing a transformation so profound that neither the crown, the court, nor the king himself could survive unchanged.